The air in Havenwood, Massachusetts, was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a perpetual shroud that clung to the town like a second skin. It was 1875, and for 16-year-old Thomas Vance, the world was a canvas of muted grays and browns, punctuated only by the somber faces of his neighbors and the imposing, weathered clapboards of his family home. The house sat on the edge of the village, a sentinel facing the ancient, unforgiving woods that swallowed the sun each evening. Inside, a different kind of darkness had begun to settle, a quiet dread that coiled in his gut with every passing day. 2 years remained until Thomas's 18th birthday, but the weight of it was already suffocating. His mother, Eleanor, a woman whose beauty had long since been etched with lines of worry, had spoken of the day with a peculiar solemnity. "When a boy becomes a man," she would say, her eyes distant, "he must face the truths that define his life." The truth she spoke of was a single, unspoken event that had marked each of his older brothers. William, now 28, and Henry, 24. William was the first. Thomas remembered him as a boy full of laughter, a whirlwind of energy who loved to disappear into the woods for hours on end, returning with pockets full of strange stones and birds' feathers. But the day after his 18th birthday, something in him had shuttered. He became a ghost in their own home, his eyes hollow, his hands perpetually trembling. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a low, defeated rasp. He spent his days in the workshop, carving intricate, disturbing figurines from wood, twisted faces and bodies that seemed to scream in silent agony. His creations were beautiful in a morbid way, but they were not the work of a man at peace. Then came Henry. He was the quiet, introspective one, a boy who spent his evenings with books, his mind a fortress of stories and history. His 18th birthday was a quiet affair. The next morning, Thomas found him at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the bleak landscape. When Thomas spoke, Henry didn't turn. "What happened?" Thomas had whispered, his young voice trembling with a fear he didn't yet understand. Henry finally looked at him, his face a mask of profound sadness. "Some things," he said, his voice barely audible, "are better left buried, little brother." Within the year, Henry had packed a single bag and left Havenwood, leaving behind a brief note. "I am sorry. I cannot stay. Do not follow." He was never heard from again. The village whispered about the Vance family. They had always been different, isolated. Thomas's father, a stoic and hard-working man, had died in a logging accident 5 years prior, leaving Eleanor to raise her 3 sons alone, a task she performed with a strange, fierce devotion. She was a respected figure, a woman of strong faith, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something unsettling, that followed her. The town's curiosity was a slow, burning fire, stoked by the fate of the Vance boys. They spoke in hushed tones of Eleanor's ritual, of the single evening she would take each son into her room after their birthday dinner, a private, solemn affair from which they emerged changed forever. Thomas's fear was a physical presence now, a cold knot in his stomach. He was a boy, yes, but he was not a fool. He knew his brothers' fates were linked, that their lives had been irrevocably altered by that single night in their mother's room. He had to know what was happening, to understand the secret that had fractured his family and turned a once vibrant home into a mausoleum of broken men. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas crept out of his room. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. He stood outside his mother's door, a sliver of candlelight visible beneath it. He heard a rustle, the soft creak of a floorboard, and then his mother's voice. It was a low, melodic murmur, a sound he had never heard before. It was not a prayer, nor was it a song. It was something else, a series of low, rhythmic whispers that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the house. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was one of deep, agonizing sorrow. He retreated, his heart pounding in his chest. This was not a ritual of faith, but of pain. Whatever his mother was doing, whatever truth she was revealing to her sons, it was destroying them. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not wait for his own turn. He had to uncover the secret of the Vance family before it was too late. He had to find out what happened behind that closed door. For now, the mystery of the Vance family remained, a dark secret whispered about in the small, insular community of Havenwood. The town had its share of shadows, and the Vance house was surely one of them. The tension in the village was a palpable thing, a quiet unease that no one dared to speak of directly, but which everyone felt. As Thomas lay in his bed, the sound of his mother's strange whispers still echoing in his mind, he knew his journey had begun. The truth was out there, buried somewhere in the history of his family and the bleak landscape of Havenwood. He just had to find it. If you're enjoying this story so far and want to see how the mystery of the Vance family unfolds, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps a ton, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get back to the story. The next morning, the house was silent and cold. William sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee before him, his gaze fixed on nothing. Thomas, emboldened by his discovery, decided to try a different approach. He took a seat across from his brother. "William," he said, his voice soft but steady. "What happened in there? What did Mother tell you?" William's eyes, once bright blue, were now a washed-out gray. He didn't answer for a long time, his silence a heavy, suffocating weight. Finally, he stirred. "It's a weight," he rasped, his voice a low scratch, a burden. He looked at Thomas, a flicker of something. Was it pity, fear, crossing his face? "You don't want to know, little brother. The truth, it poisons the soul." He then stood up and walked away, leaving Thomas alone with the stale air and the unsettling knowledge that whatever the secret was, it was not something his brother could share. Thomas's search for answers led him to the local library, a small dusty building run by Mrs. Gable, a kind but perpetually nervous woman who had been a friend of his mother's since childhood. He knew he had to be subtle. Instead of asking directly about his family, he began researching the history of Havenwood, looking for any peculiar events or tragedies that might have occurred around the time of his brother's 18th birthdays. He spent hours poring over old ledgers, local newspapers preserved on brittle, yellowed paper, and town records. The history of Havenwood was filled with the usual tragedies of a small, isolated village. A fire that destroyed the blacksmith shop, a few accidental deaths in the woods, the occasional outbreak of fever. But one recurring pattern began to emerge, a dark thread woven through the town's past. Every few years, a young man would disappear, not just from the Vance family, but from other families in the village as well. They were always around the age of 18, and their disappearances were always attributed to them running away to seek their fortune in the bigger cities. The dates of these disappearances were never exact, but Thomas noticed that they often correlated with significant events in his own family's history, like the birth of one of his brothers. The pattern was subtle, easy to dismiss, but to Thomas it felt like a cold breeze on the back of his neck. He looked for any mention of his mother's family, the Caldwells, but the records were sparse. It was as if they had sprung into existence with the Vances when they settled in Havenwood. He found an old, faded photograph in a forgotten history book of the town's first families. His mother's face, younger but with the same haunted eyes, was in the picture, standing next to his father and another man with a stern, imposing face. The man's name was listed as Mr. Caldwell, but there was no record of him or his family in the town's birth or death records. The library was also where he found Mary, a girl his own age. She was the daughter of the local doctor, and she had an insatiable curiosity that mirrored his own. She was a breath of fresh air in the suffocating silence of Havenwood, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. He told her about his brothers, about the whispers, and about his growing fear. Mary listened patiently, her bright eyes filled with concern. "My father keeps a medical log," she offered. "He's been the town doctor for 40 years. Maybe there's something in there." That night, under the cover of a dense fog, they met at Mary's house. Her father's medical log was a large, leather-bound journal filled with neat, spidery handwriting. As they flipped through the pages, they found entries for William and Henry. Both entries noted severe emotional distress and acute psychological trauma following their 18th birthdays. But what truly sent a jolt of ice through Thomas was the entry for his father. It detailed the aftermath of the logging accident, but at the end, in a section marked Psychological Assessment, his father's entry read, "Subject showed signs of deep, long-standing trauma, expressing guilt and a desire to unburden himself, believed to be related to a secret he and his wife share." Mary's face was pale in the lamplight. "Thomas, this is more than just a family secret." "I know," he whispered. "This has been going on for a long, long time." The doctor's log also had a list of the names of the young men who had disappeared. Thomas recognized some of the names as sons of the oldest families in Havenwood, families that his mother's side had been acquainted with for generations. The dates of their disappearances, when lined up with the town's history, pointed to a very specific, very strange pattern. A young man would go missing, and shortly after, a new family would move into the area. The new family would often have a young boy, around the same age as the one who had disappeared. It was a bizarre, illogical connection, but it was there, a shadow in the town's past. Mary's father's log also contained a small, separate notebook, a personal diary of sorts. In it, the doctor had written his private concerns. "I believe the Vance family's ritual is a form of inheritance," one entry read. "A secret passed down through generations. I fear what it is, but I see the result in the eyes of the sons." Another entry read, "Eleanor Vance. I believe she is not the perpetrator but the guardian, the protector of a terrible truth that she must pass on." Thomas felt a wave of nausea. His mother was not a monster. She was a victim, a guardian of a terrible secret she was forced to pass on. The thought was a cold comfort, but it didn't lessen his fear. It only deepened the mystery. What could a mother pass on to her son that would shatter him so completely? What truth was so toxic it could poison a man's soul and drive him to insanity or to flee his home forever? As he walked home that night, the fog seemed to thicken, obscuring the path. He saw a figure standing in the shadows of an ancient oak tree watching him. It was too far to make out a face, but the silhouette was tall and slender, with a peculiar stillness that sent a shiver down his spine. As he quickened his pace, the figure disappeared, melting back into the darkness. A silent watcher, a shadow in the night. The mystery was no longer a secret confined to his home. It had spilled out into the village, and someone was watching him. The following day, Thomas's fear had a name. Old Man Elias, the town's reclusive historian. Elias lived in a shack by the creek, surrounded by stacks of old books and maps. He was a frail man with a mind as sharp as a tack, known for his eccentricities and his uncanny knowledge of Havenwood's history, a knowledge that went far deeper than the official records. Thomas knew he was the only one who could truly help. He found Elias sitting on his porch, polishing a small, smooth stone. "The Vance boy," Elias said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "I knew you would come. The truth has a way of seeking out those who are ready to hear it." He motioned for Thomas to sit. "You're looking for answers about your family's secret, aren't you? The secret your mother passes on." Thomas's heart pounded. "How did you know?" "I've lived here my whole life, boy," Elias said, his eyes a sharp, knowing blue. I saw your father before he married your mother. A good, honest man. And I knew your mother's family, the Caldwells. They were a strange lot, but they were not evil. No, the evil came from a much older source. He looked out at the distant woods, a pained expression on his face. Your family, the Vances, they are not of this land. They came here to start a new life. But your mother's family, the Caldwells, they are as old as these woods. They have been the guardians of a secret for generations. Elias told him the story, a story that was not in any book. The Caldwell family was tasked with a sacred duty to protect Havenwood from an ancient secret buried beneath the old mill. The secret was not a supernatural entity, but a truth so heinous it could destroy the community. Decades ago, Havenwood was a prosperous logging town, but its wealth was built on a dark foundation. The town's founder, a charismatic but ruthless man, had discovered a massive vein of silver beneath the earth. But the vein was cursed, or so it was said. Every time a new shaft was dug, a young man would mysteriously disappear, usually one of the town's most prominent sons. The families would mourn, but the wealth kept them silent. The Caldwells, seeing the corruption and the danger of this secret, decided to take matters into their own hands. They became the keepers of the town's conscience, the silent watchmen. The secret is not about what's buried, Thomas, Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's about what was done. The Caldwells, they had a tradition. To protect the town, they had to expose the sin. But they couldn't just tell people, not with the town's power and wealth at stake. So they found a way to share the burden, to share the truth. It was a terrible choice, but they felt it was the only way to save the town. Elias then revealed the devastating truth. The disappearances were not random. The town's founder had established a system of human sacrifice, a horrific pact with the most influential families to ensure their prosperity. They would kidnap a young man from a rival family, a boy who was about to inherit his own family's wealth, and murder him, burying his body in the silver mine to appease the curse. This was done to weaken their rivals and keep the power in the hands of the chosen few. The Caldwells, upon discovering this, secretly took over the ritual, but for a different purpose. They didn't murder the young men. Instead, they took them to a secret chamber, showed them the truth, the bodies buried in the mine, the ledgers detailing the sacrifices, and gave them a choice: flee and keep the secret, or stay and fight. Your father, Thomas, he was a Caldwell, Elias said. He changed his name to Vance when he came to Havenwood to break free from the burden. He chose to run, to start a new life. But he fell in love with your mother, a Caldwell through her mother's line. And the burden, it found him again. Your mother's family, the last of the old line, passed it on to her. She had to choose a son to be the new guardian, the one to take on the burden. Thomas felt a wave of nausea, a cold, hard truth that was far worse than any ghost story. His family was not cursed by a demon, but by a horrific legacy of murder and manipulation. His mother's ritual was not a magical rite, but an act of passing on a devastating truth, a secret that had driven his father to a life of quiet despair, Henry to flee, and William to retreat into his own mind. "Why me?" Thomas asked, his voice a raw whisper. "Why not William or Henry?" "Henry chose to run to save himself from the burden," Elias explained. "William, he tried to fight it, but the truth was too much for him. It broke him. He saw something, a truth so dark it shattered his mind." Elias stood up and went into his shack, returning with an old leather-bound journal. "This is your family's history, Thomas, written by your great-grandfather. It details everything, the pacts, the murders, the sacrifices, the names of the families who are still complicit. Your mother holds the key to the location of the secret chamber, where the bodies and the evidence are buried. She has to pass it on to a son who she knows can handle the weight of it. She believes you are the one." Thomas clutched the journal, its weight a new burden. The truth was not a monster in the dark. It was a ledger of human cruelty, a legacy of silence and complicity. He realized now what his mother had been doing all these years. She was not a monster. She was a woman broken by a terrible responsibility, and her ritual was her last, desperate act of hope. She was not poisoning her sons. She was asking them to carry a weight she could no longer bear, a weight that had been passed down through her family for generations. The figure in the shadows, the silent watcher, was not a ghost. It was probably one of the descendants of the families whose names were on the list, a person tasked with ensuring the secret remained buried. The same person who had tried to intimidate Henry into staying quiet. Thomas knew what he had to do. He couldn't flee like Henry, or break like William. He had to face the truth, expose the dark heart of Havenwood, and finally put an end to the family's curse. He thanked Elias and left, the journal tucked securely in his jacket. The world was no longer grey and brown. It was a bleak landscape of shadows and secrets, and he, a 16-year-old boy, was the only one who could bring the truth to light. The journey to his 18th birthday was no longer a countdown to a personal revelation. It was a race against time to unearth the truth and set his family and his town free. Thomas's first step was to discreetly cross-reference the names in Elias's journal with the current prominent families in Havenwood. He started with the two most powerful, the Millers, who owned the new modern sawmill, and the Suttons, the town's largest landowners. His research, done under the pretense of a school project, confirmed his suspicions. Both families' ancestries could be traced directly back to the names listed in the journal. They were the descendants of the original conspirators. He began observing them, looking for any sign of their complicity. He noticed that the heads of both families, Mr. Miller and Mr. Sutton, held a quiet, almost cold control over the town council. They spoke in low, measured tones, and their decisions always seemed to benefit their own interests, regardless of the town's needs. The townspeople respected them, but a subtle undercurrent of fear and deference was always present. This was the result of a legacy of fear and unspoken threats. Thomas realized that the real threat was not a ritual, but a conspiracy that had been passed down for generations, protected by silence, money, and influence. His mother's ritual was not just a burden. It was a desperate attempt to break the cycle. She was trying to empower her sons with the truth, hoping one of them would be strong enough to do what she and her family couldn't: expose the conspirators and end the cycle of fear. He confided his findings in Mary. She was horrified but not surprised. Her father's log had hinted at a darker truth, and now they had a name for it. "We need proof," she said, her voice filled with a fierce determination. "Something more than a journal. Something that can't be dismissed as the ramblings of an old man." The key, they decided, was the secret chamber. According to Elias's journal, it was hidden somewhere in the old, abandoned mill, the very place where the sacrifices had been made. The mill was a crumbling relic, a shell of its former self, haunted by the memory of Havenwood's dark past. No one went near it. It was the perfect hiding place for the town's most terrible secret. One late afternoon, under the guise of an innocent walk, Thomas and Mary ventured into the woods towards the old mill. The air grew colder as they approached, the sound of the wind through the rotting wood like a mournful sigh. The mill was a skeletal structure, its rusted gears and broken planks a testament to a forgotten time. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the broken roof. The floorboards groaned under their feet, and every shadow seemed to hold a secret. They searched for hours, guided by the cryptic clues in Elias's journal. Behind the broken wheel, where the water once turned the stones of deceit, they found the massive rotted water wheel, its blades covered in moss and decay. Behind it, in a space that was once a narrow passage, they found a loose stone in the foundation. It was sealed with a mixture of clay and mortar, a hidden entrance. It was too heavy for them to move on their own. They knew they would need help. They returned to Elias, their clothes covered in dust and their faces pale with a mix of fear and excitement. They told him about the chamber and the loose stone. A flicker of triumph crossed the old man's face. "The final piece of the puzzle," he said. "Your mother knows the location. She can help you. But you must approach her with the truth. She will not give it up easily. She has spent her life protecting it." Thomas knew Elias was right. He had to go to his mother, to face her not as a son, but as a man who understood the burden she carried. The prospect was terrifying, but it was the only way forward. He had to bridge the chasm that had formed between them, the chasm of silence and unspoken fear. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, Thomas found his mother in the sitting room, knitting by the fire. She looked exhausted, the lines on her face deeper than ever before. He took a deep breath. "Mother," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I know about the ritual." She didn't look up, her needles clicking with a steady rhythm. "Then you know what awaits you." "No," he said, moving closer. "I know what you've been doing. I know what the Caldwell family has been doing. I know about the secret, about the mill, about the sacrifices." Her hands stilled. She looked at him then, her eyes, once haunted, now filled with a strange mix of fear and relief. "How could you know?" she whispered. "Elias," he said, "and the doctor's log, and the names. I know all of it. I know it wasn't a curse, it was a conspiracy. And I know you're trying to break it. You've been trying to find a son who is strong enough to carry the burden and expose the truth." Tears began to stream down her face, silent and hot. "I tried to protect you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I wanted to save you from this, but you are so much like your father." He couldn't carry the weight. It broke him. "Did he die in the logging accident?" Thomas asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. She shook her head slowly, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "No, the men in the woods. They were the sons of the conspirators, the ones whose families had been disgraced by the truth. They made sure the secret was buried with him. He was a good man, Thomas. He tried to unearth the truth, and it cost him his life. The truth was a punch to the gut. His father's death was not an accident. It was a murder, a consequence of his fight against the very secret his wife was tasked with guarding. He understood now. His mother's silent suffering, William's shattered mind, Henry's flight. It all made sense. They were victims of a conspiracy far older and more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. "Where is the chamber?" Thomas asked, his voice steady. "We need to expose them. We need to end this." His mother looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time in his life, he saw not a mother burdened by a terrible secret, but a woman filled with a quiet, fierce resolve. "It's time," she said, her voice a low, determined whisper. "It is time to end this." She then gave him a single, simple instruction on how to move the stone. The final piece of the puzzle was now in place. The next morning, Thomas and Mary, armed with a crowbar and a shovel, met at the old mill. The air was crisp and cold, a biting wind whispering through the trees. They worked in a tense, focused silence, the weight of their task hanging heavy in the air. They found the loose stone behind the rotted water wheel, and with a few grunts and a loud scraping sound, managed to pry it loose. The stone gave way to a dark, narrow passage, a dank tunnel that smelled of mold and decay. Mary lit a lantern, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Thomas took the lead, the old leather-bound journal clutched in his other hand. The passage was long and winding, a man-made tunnel that snaked beneath the earth. It was a testament to the effort the conspirators had put into hiding their secret. As they moved deeper, the air grew colder. The tunnel opened into a large, cavernous space, a natural chamber that had been repurposed. The lantern light revealed what they had been looking for, a sight that turned Thomas's stomach. The walls were lined with crude wooden shelves, and on those shelves, like a macabre museum, were human skeletons. They were mostly young men, their bones clean and white, stripped bare by time and the earth. Their clothes were rotted and tattered, but Thomas could make out the styles, some of them from decades, even a century ago. The bones were arranged neatly, a terrible monument to Havenwood's prosperity. "My God," Mary whispered, covering her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. Thomas's gaze fell on a stack of ledgers on a small stone table in the center of the chamber. He walked over to them, his legs feeling like lead. He opened the top ledger. The handwriting was old, faded, but the words were clear. It was a record of every sacrifice, a horrifying log of names, dates, and the families who benefited from their deaths. The most recent entries were from the mid-1800s, but there was a strange gap in the records, a gap that coincided with his father's arrival in Havenwood. As he was looking at the ledgers, something on the wall caught his eye. It was not another skeleton, but a series of scratches and carvings on the rock face. It was a message written in a shaky, desperate hand. The scratches detailed a final, chilling entry written by one of the victims before they died. The entry named the conspirators of the time and detailed how they were tricked into coming to the chamber. The final lines were a chilling plea for help and an acknowledgement that no one would ever find them. "We have to get this back to the village," Thomas said, his voice a raw whisper. "We have to show everyone." As if on cue, a loud scraping sound came from the tunnel entrance. A voice, hard and low, echoed through the chamber. "The Vances and their damn secrets. Thought you could dig up the past, did you, boy?" Mr. Miller and Mr. Sutton emerged from the tunnel, their faces grim and cold. They were not alone. Behind them were two more men, large and burly, holding lanterns, the figures from the woods, the silent watchers, the men who had killed his father. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, a drum of fear and defiance. "We know what you did," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "We know about the sacrifices. We have the proof." Mr. Miller scoffed. "Proof? An old journal and some bones? The ramblings of a crazy man and a boy? No one will believe you." "They will," Mary said, stepping forward, her voice surprisingly firm. "My father's log has your names in it, and so does the doctor's log. We'll find a way to make them believe." Mr. Sutton chuckled, a humorless, dry sound. "You won't have the chance. You're just a couple of children playing at being detectives. This secret has kept our family safe for 100 years. It won't be broken by a boy and a girl." The two men behind them began to move forward, their faces a mask of cruel indifference. Thomas knew they were not here to talk. They were here to silence them, just as they had silenced so many before. He had to think fast. He remembered the last words of the journal, the passage about the last attempt to expose the truth, written by his father's uncle. A phrase that seemed to imply a way out. He grabbed Mary's arm. "We have to go," he yelled. They sprinted for a small crevice in the wall, a dark opening he had noticed on their way in. It was too narrow for the bigger men to follow. They scrambled through, the rough rock scraping their clothes and skin. As they emerged on the other side, they found themselves in a narrow, muddy stream that ran parallel to the old mill. It was the same stream that led directly to the village center. They didn't stop to catch their breath. They ran, their feet splashing in the cold water, the sound of the men's angry shouts fading behind them. They were safe for now, but they had the evidence, the ledgers, the bones, and the truth. They had to get it to the town council. They had to expose the conspirators and end the cycle of murder and deceit that had plagued Havenwood for so long. As they ran, Thomas couldn't help but think about his mother. She had been a victim of this for so long. She had passed on a burden she hoped would be a chance for a new future, a future where Havenwood could finally be free from the ghosts of its past. His father had died fighting for this. William had broken for this. Henry had fled for this. Now it was his turn. He was no longer just a boy. He was a man, and he was carrying the weight of his family's history. But this time, he was not alone. He had Mary, and he had the truth. The journey to his 18th birthday was no longer a countdown to a personal revelation. It was a race against time, a final stand against the darkness that had consumed his family for generations. Thomas and Mary burst out of the woods and into the town square, their clothes muddy and torn, their faces streaked with dirt. It was late, but the town hall was still lit, a rare meeting of the council underway. They ran to the doors, pushing them open and stumbling inside. The council members, a group of stern-faced men including Mr. Miller and Mr. Sutton, looked up, their expressions a mix of surprise and annoyance. "What is the meaning of this?" Mr. Sutton demanded, his eyes narrowing as he recognized them. Thomas, out of breath and adrenaline-fueled, held up the ledger. "We have proof," he panted. "Proof of the sacrifices, the murders, the truth about this town's prosperity." The room fell silent. A few of the council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Miller stood up, his face a mask of false calm. "Children, you've been listening to old Elias's stories again. We'll have to have a word with him about filling your heads with nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Mary cried, her voice ringing with conviction. "My father's log, the journal from Thomas's family, the bones in the chamber, it's all there." The council members looked at each other, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. The whispers about the Vance family and their strange rituals had been circulating for years. Now, this boy was offering an explanation, however outlandish. Just then, the doors to the town hall opened again, and a group of townsfolk, alerted by the commotion, shuffled inside. Among them were the parents of the young men who had disappeared over the years. Their faces were etched with a silent, decades-long grief. Thomas saw his opportunity. He held up the journal and the ledger. "These are the names of the men who were sacrificed, the names of the families who profited from their deaths." He pointed at Mr. Miller and Mr. Sutton. "And these are the men who are still protecting the secret. Their families killed my father to keep it buried." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The accusations once whispered in the dark were now shouted in the light. Mr. Miller and Mr. Sutton, seeing the tide turn, knew they had to act fast. They began to shout, trying to drown out Thomas's voice, accusing him of lying, of being a disturbed child. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Suddenly a voice rang out from the back of the room. "The boy is telling the truth." It was Eleanor Vance. She walked through the crowd, her head held high, her eyes filled with a terrifying, righteous fire. "I have carried this burden for years. I was not a woman who cursed her sons. I was a woman who was passing on a legacy of truth, a truth that would set us all free." She walked to the front of the room and looked at the council members. "Ask yourselves," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur that silenced the room. "Why have the Millers and the Suttons always held the most power? Why have they always controlled the town's wealth? Because they are standing on a foundation of bones. The bones of our sons, our brothers, our neighbors." The crowd erupted. The parents of the disappeared boys began to weep openly. The quiet fear and suspicion that had been simmering for generations finally boiled over into outrage. The truth, no longer a secret, was a wildfire. Mr. Miller and Mr. Sutton, seeing the mob turn against them, tried to make a run for it. But the townspeople, a unified force of grief and anger, blocked their way. The local sheriff, a stoic and quiet man, stepped forward. He had always been a man of few words, but his face now held a grim determination. "Mr. Miller, Mr. Sutton," he said, his voice low and firm, "you're coming with me. We'll need to see this chamber you're so intent on keeping secret." The truth had been unveiled. The town, once divided by whispers and suspicion, was now united in its outrage. Thomas and Mary had not just exposed a secret, they had given a community a reason to heal. The weight of his family's past, the burden that had broken his brothers and killed his father, was finally lifted. As the sheriff led the two men away, Thomas looked at his mother. Her face, for the first time in years, held a look of peace. She had carried the burden, but she had passed it on to a son who was strong enough to face the truth. He had not only saved himself, but he had saved his family's honor and the entire town. The village of Havenwood would never be the same. The scars of its past would remain, but they would no longer fester in silence. The story of the sacrifices, of the Vance family, and of the conspiracy would be told. The truth, once a curse, was now a painful but necessary foundation for a new beginning. The days and weeks following the unveiling of Havenwood's dark secret were a whirlwind of activity. The sheriff, armed with the evidence from the chamber, launched a full investigation. The skeletal remains were identified, and the names of the victims were read aloud in a solemn town meeting. The town's prominent families, who had long benefited from the conspiracy, were brought to justice. Mr. Miller and Mr. Sutton, along with their accomplices, were arrested and faced charges of conspiracy and murder. The town, once a place of quiet, simmering unease, was now a community united in its grief and its resolve. A memorial was erected near the old mill, a simple stone monument engraved with the names of the lost sons. It was a painful reminder of the town's history, but also a symbol of its commitment to a more just future. For the Vance family, the aftermath was a time of healing. William, seeing the truth brought to light, began to slowly emerge from his shell. He still carved his wooden figures, but now they were not twisted and tormented. They were figures of birds in flight, of people holding hands, of hope. The hollow look in his eyes began to fade, replaced with a quiet, if fragile, sense of peace. The burden that had broken him was gone, and he could finally begin to heal. Eleanor Vance, a woman who had carried the weight of her family's secret for a lifetime, was now seen by the town not as an eccentric outcast, but as a hero. She had done what no one else could, what no one else dared to. She had passed on a devastating truth, but in doing so, she had saved a community. Her silence was not one of complicity, but of a quiet, fierce resolve. The lines of worry on her face began to soften, replaced by a serenity she had never known. Thomas, now a local hero, found himself at a crossroads. He had uncovered the truth, he had faced the darkness, and he had won. But what came next? He had to rebuild his life, a life that had been defined by a family secret. The town was grateful, but he was still a young man, and the memories of what he had uncovered would never truly leave him. Mary, his steadfast partner, was by his side through it all. She helped him sort through the old records, and together they wrote a new history of Havenwood, one that told the truth without embellishment. Their friendship deepened, growing into a bond of shared experience and mutual respect. She saw the man he had become, a man who had faced the darkness and emerged with his integrity intact. One afternoon, Thomas stood by his father's grave. The headstone, once a simple marker, now felt like a monument to a hero. He knelt and placed a small, polished stone on top of it. It was a stone his brother William had carved, a symbol of a man who fought for the truth and a son who finished his fight. "We did it, Father," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We set them free." Later that evening, as he sat with his mother and William, the silence in the house was no longer heavy with dread. It was a comfortable, peaceful silence, the silence of a family finally at rest. He thought of Henry, his brother who had fled, and felt a pang of sadness. He had sent him a letter, a long one, detailing everything. He hoped Henry would read it, and that one day he would return to a Havenwood that was no longer a town of secrets, but a town of healing. His 18th birthday was no longer a source of dread. It was just a day, a celebration of a boy who had become a man. not through a ritual of fear, but through an act of courage. The psychological terror, the suspense, the mystery, it was all gone, replaced by a difficult but necessary truth. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to support us. It means a lot. Thank you for watching. Life in Havenwood began to slowly return to a new normal. The arrests and trials of the conspirators dominated the local news, but soon the story faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of town life. The old mill was torn down, its history of darkness finally put to rest. In its place, the town built a new community center, a place of light and gathering, a symbol of their new beginning. Thomas, now 18, was no longer just a boy. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen to stand against it. The experience had aged him, leaving a quiet wisdom in his eyes, but it had not broken him. He worked alongside his mother and brother, helping to rebuild their home and their lives. The house that had once felt like a mausoleum now felt like a home again, filled with the warmth of shared experiences and the quiet comfort of a family, finally at peace. One crisp autumn day, a letter arrived. It was from Henry. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he opened it. The handwriting was neat and familiar. Henry had received the letter. He had read it, and he was coming home. The day Henry returned was filled with a nervous anticipation. Thomas and William waited on the porch, watching the road. Finally, a lone figure appeared, walking with a steady gait. It was Henry. He had grown taller, his face more weathered, but the familiar kind eyes were still there. As he approached, a wave of emotion washed over them all. Eleanor rushed out to greet him, her face filled with tears. Henry embraced her, a long, heartfelt hug. Then he turned to Thomas and William. The brothers stood for a moment, just looking at each other. Henry's eyes, once so full of a profound sadness, now held a glimmer of hope. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You broke the cycle." The conversation that followed was long and filled with unspoken words. Henry told them about his life away from Havenwood, of the jobs he had taken, the people he had met. He admitted that he had been too afraid to face the truth, to stand up to the weight of the family's legacy. He had chosen to run, and it was a choice he had regretted every day since. "I tried to convince myself that I was the lucky one," he said, his gaze falling to the floor. "That I had escaped, but I was just running from myself. You stayed and you fought. You saved us all." William, who had remained silent, now spoke. "You came back, Henry," he said, his voice a quiet, steady thing. "That's what matters." The family sat together that evening, a united front against the shadows of the past. The return of Henry was the final piece of their healing. They were not a broken family anymore, but a family that had been tested and had come out stronger on the other side. They had each carried the burden in their own way, and now they could finally lay it down. Thomas looked around the room, at his mother, at his two brothers. The house was not perfect. The scars of the past would always remain. But the ghosts were gone, replaced by a new kind of silence, a silence that was filled with love and understanding. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been revealed, and in the end it was not the truth that had shattered them, but the silence and the secrecy. The story of the Vance family would be passed down, not as a dark legend, but as a tale of resilience, of courage, and of the power of a family's love. It was a painful story, but it was a true one, and it was the truth that had set them free. Havenwood was a town reborn, its transformation a slow, deliberate bloom from the ashes of its dark history. The change wasn't instantaneous, it was a daily effort, a conscious choice made by every citizen to build a better future. The old guard, the conspirators who had controlled the town's economy and its very soul for generations, were gone. Their homes, once grand and imposing symbols of their illicit wealth, were sold off to new families, people who brought with them a fresh perspective and an eagerness to contribute to a genuine community. In their place, a new town council was formed, not of a few powerful families, but of honest, hard-working people from all walks of life: a farmer, a seamstress, a shopkeeper, a logger. They were committed to a single principle: that the town's prosperity should be distributed more equitably, that its success should benefit everyone, not just a select few. The town's meager treasury, once used to fund the self-serving projects of the elite, was now directed towards common good, investing in new schools, mending the rutted roads, and establishing a small public library in the space that was once the grimy, forgotten office of a disgraced mill owner. The air in Havenwood felt different now. The perpetual scent of damp earth and wood smoke was still there, but it was no longer heavy with a sense of unspoken dread. It was simply the smell of a town at work, of a life being lived honestly. Thomas and Mary, now a couple, became the unofficial historians of this new era. They worked closely with the new council, their knowledge of the past serving as a moral compass for the future. They helped to write a new town charter, one that explicitly forbade secret meetings and mandated transparency in all town affairs. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of a shared trauma, was a symbol of the new Havenwood, a place built on honesty, transparency, and justice. They understood that the past could not be erased, but it could be remembered in a way that would prevent history from repeating itself. They gave tours of the memorial at the site of the old mill, not to sensationalize the town's dark history, but to honor the victims and to reinforce the collective promise that such darkness would never take root again. William, fully healed, found his purpose in his hands. He took over his father's workshop, the same space where he had once carved his tormented figures. Now his creations were imbued with a different spirit. His carvings became renowned throughout the region, not just for their technical skill, but for the profound stories they told. He created a series he called the Havenwood Chronicle, with each piece depicting a different aspect of the town's journey. There were carvings of the mill in its sinister glory, of men and boys with hollow eyes, and then a series that showed the townspeople working together, the new council meeting, and a family finally united. His art was a testament to his own healing, a tangible way for him to process the darkness he had seen and to channel it into something beautiful and redemptive. It was a silent, powerful sermon on the capacity of the human spirit to endure and to find light even after the deepest shadows. His hands, once perpetually trembling with fear, now moved with the steady, purposeful calm of a man who had found his peace. Henry, the man who had once fled from his family's burden, now dedicated his life to serving the community he had once abandoned. He became a teacher, a mentor to the young boys of Havenwood. He taught them history and mathematics, but more importantly, he taught them about the importance of courage, integrity, and truth. He used his own life as a lesson, telling them of the time he had run from a secret that had shattered his family. He taught them that secrets, no matter how small, could fester and become something monstrous. That silence was a powerful tool of the wicked, and that speaking the truth was the greatest act of bravery. His return was not just a reunion with his family, but a new beginning, a way for him to atone for his past and to build a better future for the next generation. He was a living testament to the fact that it was never too late to turn back, to face your fears, and to find your place in the world. Eleanor, no longer burdened by the secret she had guarded for a lifetime, became a pillar of the community. She was a respected elder, a woman who had seen the town at its darkest and had played a pivotal role in bringing it into the light. The townspeople, who had once viewed her with suspicion and fear, now looked to her for guidance, for wisdom, and for the quiet strength that had carried her through the darkest of times. Her home, once a place of silence and dread, became a hub of warmth, laughter, and family gatherings. She hosted weekly dinners for the new council, her kitchen filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and the sound of lively conversation. She had done what she had to do, and in doing so, she had not only saved her family, but had helped an entire community find its soul. The Vance family, once isolated and feared, was now at the heart of the new Havenwood. They were no longer defined by their dark past, but by their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering commitment to the truth. The story of the mother who took each son into her room was no longer a tale of terror, but a story of a mother's fierce love, of a desperate act to save her sons from a terrible fate. It was a story that had begun in darkness, but had ended in the light, a testament to the power of a family's love to overcome even the most profound secrets and the deepest of sorrows. Years passed, flowing like a peaceful river through the heart of a town that had finally found its footing. Havenwood prospered, its newfound honesty proving to be a stronger foundation than the lies and deceit of the past. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer open wounds. They were faint lines on the town's face, a reminder of where they had been and a testament to how far they had come. The old fear was gone, replaced by a quiet vigilance. The new generation of Havenwood citizens grew up in a town that was honest, transparent, and fair. They knew the story of the sacrifices of the Vance family and of the young men who had died. But they knew it not as a secret to be whispered in the dark, but as a lesson to be learned in the light. Thomas and Mary's relationship, which had begun as a partnership in a desperate quest for the truth, blossomed into a love that was as enduring as the old oak trees that lined the town square. They were married in a quiet, simple ceremony, surrounded by a community that had come to see them as their own. They had children of their own, a boy and a girl, and they raised them in a home filled with love, laughter, and, above all, the unwavering commitment to truth. Thomas never forgot what he had gone through, the fear, the dread, the terrifying journey he had taken, but he no longer felt the weight of it. It was a part of him, a part of his story, but it no longer defined him. The psychological terror, the mystery, the suspense, it had all been a prelude to the most powerful truth of all, that love and honesty were the only forces strong enough to conquer the deepest darkness. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Thomas sat in his armchair, his son on his lap, reading him a story. On the small table beside him lay a worn, leather-bound journal. It was the Vance family journal, the one that had held the secret for so long. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words were a testament to the courage of a family that had finally chosen to fight rather than flee. Thomas had read it countless times over the years, but he had never told his children its full story. Not yet. The truth was a powerful thing, and he wanted to wait until they were old enough to understand its weight, its gravity, and its ultimate power to set them free. He wanted them to learn the history of their family not through fear, but through love and understanding. He looked down at his son, his face lit by the warm glow of the fire. The boy's eyes were wide with a childlike wonder, a stark contrast to the hollow, haunted eyes of his brother William all those years ago. Thomas knew, with a deep and profound certainty that settled in his soul, that the cycle was finally, truly broken. His son would not have to face the truth in a dark room on his 18th birthday. He would learn it in the light, in the warmth of his home, surrounded by the love of his family. The burden of the past would not be passed on to him. Instead, he would inherit a legacy of courage, a story of a boy who had faced a monster only to discover that the true monster was not a thing of nightmares, but the human capacity for silence and deceit. The story of the mother who took each son into her room at 18 was no longer a mystery to be feared. It was no longer a tale of psychological terror or suspense. It was a story of a family's fight for the truth, of a town's struggle for redemption, and of a boy who, with courage and determination, had not only saved himself but had set an entire town free. The final chapter had been written, and it was a happy one, a testament to the power of a family's love to conquer even the deepest, most terrifying of secrets. The end was not the end, but a new beginning, a promise of a future where the only secrets kept were the happy surprises of life itself.